Of course, the first the first word that comes out of my mouth is thank you very much. I mean, I didn't expect this kind of congress, conference to take place. And how it developed and where we are standing now, I'm really shocked in a very good way, but I've been thinking what to say, how to say thanks. And I don't have better words than the simple one. Of course, what I think and celebrate, leave aside, I mean, thank you very much for all the praise that I received during the conference. Sometimes I said, who is Guillermo Calvo? Because that one I don't know. And if there is something that resembles what you have described in different words, well, I'm very glad. Thank you. But before passing to some specific topics that I want to touch, and I think that they may be relevant, I want to thank very much the organizers. I mean, Andy and Martin, done tremendous, plus all the people that worked around them, something which is really fantastic. And not only for my ego, so, you know, I think it's a public good that has been produced. And I want to elaborate on that. I knew that I had to say some words at the end, so I said, what is the most productive way to summarize where we are, what we have learned? Because I have learned a lot from this. Leaving aside the specifics, I have learned of the importance of gatherings of this sort, where you have different generations, and thinking about ideas, like in the case of time inconsistency, go back many years when some of them were just babies, and having a discussion where the old generation, my generation, can continue discussing with the new one in a productive way. It's something so valuable, I think, because we insist on institutions. We've been talking about that. How do you create institutions if you don't have a language, if you don't have a culture? And I think establish a culture that is acceptable for the rest of the population. Culture in terms of economics, of economics principles, is not easy. Because the problem with economics is that what's good sometimes is very unpopular because people don't understand. And to make them understand, they have to learn perhaps a lot of economics and be convinced about what we read, and have a competition of ideas with politicians who, I'm not blaming them, but they have a different job. And for them it's much easier, for a populist, it's much easier to reach lots of people than for economists. So I celebrate the fact that we continue talking. I'm glad, not because I was part of the creation of some of the ideas or development of some of the ideas, but the fact that those ideas are still around, and what happened before and the research that we are celebrating here seems to be useful still. And it's a base, it's an important base. But leaving aside this general comment, I thought, I don't want to make this long, I thought there are two issues that I want to emphasize. And there is one development or fact in macroeconomics, which I don't know if you are aware about the importance of the dimensions that it took, that I want to talk about. And that is about the development of macroeconomics from about 1950, mid-1950s, to the first 20 years of the 1970s. The macro during that period was a macro that we wouldn't recognize today. It's not the macro that we use. And the fact is that we didn't have a framework to think about the future. Macroeconomics, the dynamic macroeconomics that started to grow when macro tried to liberate itself from the ISLM static model, right? We started with the Phillips curve and all of that, was very primitive. And when we tried to do comparative dynamics, we typically did exercises like asking ourselves, what happens if the money supply increases by 10% and stays there? Or start to grow at 2% per year and stays there? Now you wonder why that simple-minded exercises dominated. Well, the answer is we didn't know how to deal with the model when you had a future and perfect foresight. And we know now, because we all are familiar with saddle path. But when they tried to do this, when macroeconomists tried to do this, they didn't have the right model. And it's amazing. This is something that started to really be taken seriously by macroeconomists. I mean, the problem of instability with perfect foresight around the paper of Phil Kagan on hyperinflation. He shows, and it's very straightforward, under the assumption of adaptive expectations, that if you fix money supply constant, and now start with typical adaptive expectations, you revise the rate, expected rate of inflation according to the latest information, blah, blah, blah. And if the adjustment is faster and faster, before getting to be a perfect adjustment of reading exactly what happened in the last instant, before you get there, all of a sudden the system becomes totally unstable, in the sense that with a constant money supply, say inflation would be zero, but in the same model, if instead of being zero it's positive, then it goes to infinity or to minus infinity. I don't know if that's being taught or discussed these days, but we were at the time very concerned. I was personally concerned because I was always obsessed by these issues of credibility, so I couldn't just formulate the problem. Of course, there was a conceptual error. It was many people thought that letting the response parameter or the adjustment parameter go to infinity, so have perfect, that was not perfect foresight. It was the opposite. It was always looking back. So you don't get to the future by pushing from the past. So there was a problem there. That's a mathematical problem. You say, oh, fine. So we have a mathematical problem, and so some people try to move away from that. But on the other hand, macro had been born under the aegis of sticky prices. So the question is, suppose I increase money supply at a certain rate, and this is a surprise shock. You wonder what happens. Well, you have to establish an initial condition. So the bias at the time was to say, well, the initial condition was the initial price, because the price level doesn't jump. But But if you do that, then we know, we are very familiar in the saddle path kind of world. That saddle path typical result, there's only one path, which is normally say, will not explode, all the others explode. So you couldn't even go to square one. And now we are talking about credibility. We couldn't be talking about it. We could not talk about that. So that issue was tried to some extent by pushing the models, keeping adaptive expectation. But if you have adaptive expectation, basically you are looking backwards. So, and the exercise of credibility on all of that, and timing consistency, imagine timing consistency in a framework like that. If I expect that prices will be changed money will be changed in the future, that's even more, where do I start? I don't even know where prices are going to be in that moment of the future where the shock happens, right? Even though I anticipate, how do we put that together? Well, that's a very nice, neat paper by Sargent and Waller. That was written in 1972. And the paper by Phil Kagan on hyperinflation, which as a hyperinflation paper is very good, was written in 1956, I believe, something like that. So there you have it, 20 years. So when you think of that, when I started to look at that, you get shocked. You see how unsophisticated we were, that we didn't know how to deal with that. So I think part of the rational expectation revolution that I recover as a positive addition, independently of many other things, is precisely that it helped to develop a framework. We can talk about the future, and that rationality makes sense. Now, of course, we may disagree on the details, and that's interesting because models are there to be changed, not to be admired. So that's no problem. But 20 years where we will not able to make a reasonably good analysis of macroeconomy on issues which are so central. So why do I bring this up? I think it's a lesson from the past and a warning. Because this shows that there could be a tendency, which is not something completely unusual, that going back to old models keeps us there. And I always think of models as the thing that you use in order to have insights on the real complicated world. But sometimes I also think that models, not sometimes, they are also cages, golden cages that prevent you to see beyond the model. That's why I think in a more outside the box is good. So one has to be doing that exercise constantly, I believe. And that's how you can, by the way, for the young generation who are still very productive, that's one very simple way of writing papers that may be influential. So now I move to the second part of what I wanted to say, and it's related to this. I think we've been talking a lot about inflation, things related to that, and when you talk about those issues, I always get the feeling that conventional conventional theory dominates, in the sense that it's very easy to go back to the standard model. And when there are shocks that are very different from the ones in the past, one has to be very careful with that. And in particular, why do I care about this? Because we moved into a world that we didn't understand for a long time. And after 2008, remember the discussion, the quantity theory of money guys kept thinking that the inflation will accelerate and blah, blah, blah. And others have different views. And we are learning that, oh yeah, we have certain assets that were liquid and stopped to be liquid, the toxic assets. Well, that was new facts, right? So put the toxic back there, and then now it's working back. And the moment that, like now, inflation flares up, I see people going back to the quantity theory of money very quickly. What about the financial sector? What happened? I mean, something must have happened. I have a sense of, I guess, Mori today in talking about this wonderful presentation he made, and I'm very thankful. The existence of new liquid assets being spreading and growing, and I don't think we understand them very well as yet. But what does it do? And there's one puzzle that I want to make you think about, or one question which is interesting. We are now, the dominant model is the new Keynesian model, right? Keynesian model has money, let's call it money, transactional asset, and then the real economy, and there is a price stickiness, and then you have an equilibrium with unemployment, right, because of price stickiness. But you have a well-defined equilibrium. I suppose in that context I put two monies. They're not necessarily perfect substitutes, but the two can be used as a transaction means. Suppose you do that. I've done that with Carlos Weg on currency substitution models. What did we do? Well, by assumption, we said unemployment will be there. We never thought that that would eliminate, having two monies would eliminate unemployment. So we went ahead, and really what we did implicitly was to aggregate the two monies into a new money. So you have, again, a money, kind of different kind of money that was a function of interest rates, the supply, blah, blah, blah. But still, there was a predetermined money in a certain sense, and given that prices were predetermined, you have unemployment again. But think out to the box. Maybe there is an equilibrium where you have full employment, and there is this equilibrium in the system, because otherwise that wouldn't be a problem at all. So it is to be expected there is this equilibrium, but not in the labor market. Maybe it is equilibrium between the two monies. There could be an excess demand for money and excess supply of the other money. Is that possible? I have a little paper where I claim it is. But you see, if I went into that, looking at that issue, thinking of the new Keynesian model, and I know that because it's been years, I don't know when I wrote the paper, actually, that kind of paper with Carlos Rodriguez in the 1970s, I believe. And just now, in 2000, when I thought about this, 17, something like that, many years, I started thinking, why would there be only that kind of equilibrium that we are used to? Maybe there is another one, given that you have two money. And can it be sustained? And in that little note that I wrote, and I'm still working, and if people are interested, I'll be happy to share with you, I claim that there is a full employment equilibrium, depending on, and I'm not going to go into details, don't worry, whether you put money in the utility function or as in a cash in advance. When you put it in a cash in advance, the two monies can be used to haggle. When you put them in the utility function, you never think about haggling. But when you put in the cash in advance sort of constraint, you can play with that and find that it's going to be more tempting to market players who have excess capacity to use prices in order to haggle. And once they get there to full employment, they don't have incentives to move away from it. But this is just working in progress. But I mention it because I said to myself, my goodness, so many years to something so obvious that I should have thought at the first touch. Never thought about it. And started to get worried about it. In fact, I found this. Hopefully is the right result. When precisely around the global financial crisis and the creation of new liquidities, and all of a sudden the much greater liquidity of treasury T-bonds, for example. So the question arises in that context, and I'm not going to elaborate on that, but I just wanted to put it on the table. For example, think of the dollar and the euro. I mean, several years back, not a lot, there was no euro. Now you have at least those two. These are reserve currencies, and the euro is a large stock out there, and there's been a lot of movement. The relative price of M2 in dollars and M2 in the euro. Now, if these were two monies, it's like all of a sudden, when you think about that kind of world, you are in currency substitution, but maybe at the global level, because the currency substitution models that we play with in the past is one where you have the peso and then you bring the dollar. I'm not very concerned about that because these are two very different monies. I don't want to enter to detail. But when you have the euro M2 and the US M2, all of a sudden it's to take that more seriously. And if they have to do something with money supply at the world level, that will have an impact, changes in the composition, which have been, by the way, have some graphs in a recent note that I was trying to write. The composition of those M2 has changed tremendously since the beginning of the pandemic, and now seems to be going back. I mean, there was at the beginning there was a dollar dominance in terms of M2s, and all of a sudden now it's going back that way. Now, if that has an impact on inflation, this may be a new factor that we want to keep track of. So my obsession, if you wish, these days in macro is let's make an effort not to miss something that may be important, maybe not, and we are fine. We can use the old models. I'll be more than happy. But I think there is room there to entertain yourself at the very least. Okay, let me get to the end, but there is something that we have not discussed here, and it's a phenomenon that comes back, and when it's being mentioned, people get worried, they're concerned for different reasons, and I'm talking about dollar dominance. And we talk about dollar dominance as if you can talk about that and go to sleep. Well, when I started to talk about dollar dominance, I didn't sleep very well for several days. So I started to think about why the hell is that happening? and came up with a conjecture. But when something so fundamental like that, I observe and takes me by surprise. One of the things I do, I go back and read the general theory. And it turns out that what I had figured is subsumed in one paragraph of the general theory into something which I call the price theory of money. And I will read the quotation. The fact that contracts are fixed and wages are usually somewhat stable in terms of money unquestionably plays a large part in attracting to money so high a liquidity premium. See, the question is why a $10 bill is trash, right? And you can buy a sandwich. So that's a liquidity premium. This is a fundamental question. And the answer implicit in this is that what's the backup of the dollar is the price setters, is us. So always the standard, when you think about macro, is a fixed prices is a problem. And some institutions insist that you want to have flexible wages and stuff like that. If that goes away, then you get to perfect general equilibrium, for example, in simple model, right? And what this suggests is that in order for money to be taken seriously, it has to have a backup. Now, in Latin America, we've been talking about reserves. Why do we think about reserves? The question is, why is the dollar so strong? Under this perspective, it's strong because there are lots of people around the world, and we know that from the recent empirical work that came out of the IMF, Gita Gopinath and the whole group, and Pierre Kurincha, and so on, that the fact, I mean, that's a fact. So that, I don't know if that's a whole explanation, but it's an interesting explanation. And one that is very different from the one provided by microeconomists. I discussed that once with Alan Taylor, a new professor at Columbia University, and he said, this is a macro foundations of money, not micro. And why? Because microeconomists normally don't have sticky prices. Sticky prices come from economics, from macroeconomics. We take sticky prices seriously. So what is really given a foundations to money, to making it credible, is the fact that people set the prices in terms of that money. And besides, I guess he says that, he doesn't talk about staggered prices. But in that context, staggered prices are even a better anchor, because without that, it's possible that all prices will jump at the same time. But if that's not possible, then you go and continue transacting in terms of dollars, because there is an inflation now. We are concerned, but it's not like Argentina where you can go 10, 15% a month, right? And partly it's because you have the system which is not capable of generating a very large increase in prices. So that's another factor that I think we should bring in. And maybe that explains also why, there's a lot of talk that the China currency is going to substitute for the dollar and so on. But in order to do that, if the Keynes insight has value, you really have to convince lots of people to set the international prices. I think about 70% of which are in dollar or something like that, very large number, all of a sudden into yuan. And that is going to take time, at the very least. So, and in the meantime, new monies appear. I mean, like M2 in the euro area. So introducing these considerations into the models is something I think we should, instead of just saying, well, it's dollar dominance, or no, it's not going to be because of political. The discussion is at the political level, not in terms of economics. So what have we learned? And again, if there is theory, and there is a lot of microeconomic, very interesting theory, which personally I don't think is very useful for a macroeconomist, but still there is out there, it's very different. That theory rules out sticky prices. So this makes the foundations of money a macro issue. And actually, in that sense, if you really succeed in having flexible prices, you may be destroying the value of money. If without money, there is nothing else. I mean, we have to realize we don't take it sufficiently seriously. But for someone who comes from high inflation or borderline hyperinflation economy, you know what it means. We saw here in 2008, and all of a sudden you didn't know if the value of what you had in the bank will be maintained, and so it's a destruction of the whole economy. And we are playing with that. And in the context of that, you hear sometimes for example, you're weaponizing the dollar. But because it's strong, I weaponize it. You may be leading. Now, the coordination factor could be the policy of weaponizing money, a dollar. Now, if you enter that route, and if you think that without sticky prices there is no money, because it's going to be difficult to have no money, I don't know what can come out of that. There could be a sudden fragmentation. Forget about globalization. Some sort of globalization will be there. But all of a sudden you will be able to have trade with other regions if you don't have a means of payment that they can trust. And this is a dilemma. The US is a strong one momentarily, but if the US starts sharing it with others, maybe it's time to think seriously of Bretton Woods too. Even among friendly countries, to have some coordination. I hope that is not needed at all. But I think part as theorists in this group of very distinguished economists who think seriously about models is one of the topics that I would give first priority. Well, I'm sure that I've talked too much, but I wanted to mention this because, we've seen that how very talented group of economists can fall into the vicious circle of using models that are no good for analyzing things that now we are celebrating are fundamental, right? For certain things, credibility, time inconsistency, nothing of that could be seriously analyzed. In fact, that's why when I started and the other people in that field started to work on that in the 70s, we were thrown out of the classrooms. When I gave this paper that we are celebrating at Columbia, in Chicago, Uh, and I had spell out the nature of the model and the results. Somebody in the audience says, but this doesn't work. And everybody seemed to be very quickly convinced that it didn't work. So they said, okay, Guillermo, why don't we go and have a drink? So we stopped, I think, after less than 10 minutes. And they were very friendly. Lucas was there. And we went and have a drink. And then I came back, and I was in the airport and spoke with my wife, said, how did it go? I said, I think it was a disaster, but I'm very confident. I go back to Colombia, because I was teaching here, go back to Colombia, and after 2 or 3 days, I received a letter, handwritten letter, by Bob Lucas, apologizing, writing the model that now you know is in continuous time, in discrete time. And he apologizing, said, you are absolutely right. We missed you completely. Imagine, I mentioned that not to, show off, but we are talking about people who are very sophisticated. And this paper maybe I presented there in 1957. So they were working very hard on issues of this sort. But it got to the point of really thinking that this piece that now everybody uses was entirely wrong. It was, and particularly because a Bellman's principle was not satisfied, and it is not satisfied. Because the Bellman principle says that if you maximize an integral, then it must be true from 0 to infinity, that from t0 in the future to infinity, if you start in t0, you will have the same policy. But that's not true because it is in this kind of model. So these are examples I'm giving out to show how easy it is to fall into a trap. And when you come out of the trap, sometimes you really hit a valuable thing. So these are basically my reflections. I want to thank very much the organizers, all of you who participated. I think this exercise is very valuable for me, because otherwise, especially for the young are always thinking of the next paper they will write. But that's the wrong approach, could be the wrong approach. Once in a while, just put on a good music, think about some idea that could be crazy, and let your mind develop without the rigor of the standard models. Get a group of people who are equally motivated. Life is better that way, I promise you. And sometimes you can get very good papers out of that. Thank you very much.